Hello, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Allie, and today I'm doing one of my true crime videos where I just sit and tell you about a crime. I tend to like to do more like mysteries, but today I wanted to sit down and talk about some myths involved in a certain case that I am sure a lot of us know about. Now, I want to put a trigger warning, even though I highly believe I'm not responsible for your own triggers and what triggers you and all that stuff. I still want people to keep in mind that this topic can be difficult to hear about. And there are certain things that I'm not going to go in depth about. But the reason that I kind of wanted to talk about this case in particular is because there are so many stories that came out of Columbine, some that are true, some that are untrue, and part of the interesting thing about Columbine is it's become almost like a mythical event, and so many different things come out of it. So that's why I wanted to talk about it. I got a lot of my information from the book Columbine. I can't remember who it's by, but I'll link all my sources down below. And I do apologize for the reflection in my glasses, and I also apologize if the sound is off. I got a mic. I've never had a mic before, so it's probably going to be a learning curve. I will fix what I can in post-production, but if not, it is what it is, and we'll just try harder next time. So let's go ahead and get started. I also have a script up of all my information up here, so if you see me looking over here, that's why. So on April 20th, 1999, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold walked into their high school, Columbine High School. They had Tech 9s, sawed-off shotguns, a few bombs that they'd made themselves, and knives. They killed 12 students, one teacher, and ultimately they ended up killing themselves as well. And when we talk about Columbine, a lot of different images start flooding through our minds, and a lot of different stories may come to mind, especially for millennials, because I feel like millennials remember 1999 and specifically Columbine so much differently than people that would have been born post Columbine or even post 9/11, right? Because I know I went to school pre Columbine and pre 9/11. I didn't go to schools with metal detectors and bag searches and things like that. To be fair, I also didn't live in a big city at that time. But many students now, their experience going into school is so much different, and a lot of that stems from Columbine. A lot of us remember zero tolerance policies, and a lot of us remember a lot of in-school service days about bullying and things like that, and a lot of myths and misinformation also came from this. So we remember looking at goth kids differently, or we remember looking at nerds differently. And many of our pop culture has also been affected by Columbine. So Columbine as a phenomenon it's changed the way America views so many things. Before I get into the myths, I want to talk about a timeline for that day. And like I said, I'm not going to get too in depth about certain things, but I think giving you a visual is going to be the best thing to do, especially if, I think for the most part, we're all familiar with Columbine, but you'd be surprised how many people don't actually know what happened that day. On April 20th, Eric and Dylan entered the school at about 11 p.m. And what's interesting about this is they first arrived in the school, and they arrived outside, and they had duffel bags full of guns, and they had what were called sweeper jackets or something, just long trench coats on. And at 11, Dylan went to place a bomb in the cafeteria, and that was where the most of the damage was supposed to occur, was the cafeteria. They'd planned this attack at 11 because that was when a certain lunch period was happening. And what's interesting about the timeline is there are some discrepancies between what happened, what we think happened, and what's on tape, because Columbine High School did have cameras at the time. But at around 10:45, the janitor would go up to change the tape. And something happened that day where there was a delay in the changeover from the tapes. So there was no way to actually tell what time the bomb was placed because it didn't catch Dylan or Eric in the act of placing the bomb during, it was lunch A, which was the busiest lunchtime. They also placed bombs at the fire department, which was just like a few blocks from the school. And the hope was that they wanted to have the bomb at the fire department detonate, right? Because that's a city building, and ultimately, like, you need the fire department if a bomb goes off. So they wanted the bomb at the fire department to detonate first to cause a distraction, and that way they wouldn't be able to respond to the bomb inside the school. The only problem with this was that the bomb at the fire department never ended up going off. It was they had several that were near the fire department, and the one that did go off, it caused a really small fire, and then it just went out. They also had explosives in the parking lot that they had hoped to detonate as well. Again, to distract from what was going on in the school. They wanted to create any sort of barrier to get, in between the police and the school. But, and they also wanted, they kind of, in their minds, came up with where the EMTs would be. So they set up bombs there as well, in the hopes that people that were receiving treatment from the injuries inside of the school would then go to the EMTs to receive treatment, and then the bombs would go off and it would ultimately kill them as well. All of those bombs failed. So that is probably the biggest gift in the whole scenario, and it's actually something that a lot of people don't know. A lot of people don't even know about the bombs, but had those bombs gone off, it would have been absolutely catastrophic and would have probably killed thousands of people, because what a lot of people don't realize is Columbine was a giant school. It had thousands of students, and had those bombs gone off, it would have been absolutely catastrophic. They walked into the school and started shooting at about 11:19. The shooting started at about 11:19, and students were eating lunch outside, and so that's where the shooting began. Rachel Scott and Richard Castaldo were both outside eating lunch, and Rachel and him were shot first. Rachel died instantly, and Richard became paralyzed from the waist down. They began walking towards the school, and they continued shooting. They killed Daniel Rorbo and Lance Kirkland. And funny enough, there was a student named Sean Graves who survived by pretending to play dead. He was paralyzed from the waist down, but he was able to lay down and just pretend that he was dead. And that's how he ultimately ended up surviving. Daniel actually becomes an interesting part of this story because he doesn't die instantly. And in fact, someone found him, and he was also paralyzed, and they propped him up against the door, and they went to go find help. But he ended up dying before help could arrive. But he was left on the scene for hours, and this greatly upset the family because in footage, when the media finally arrived, you could see him just sitting there, and no one was moving him, no one was touching him. He was just sitting there, propped up. And it actually resulted in several lawsuits because no one responded, and they don't know for sure if he had received medical help, if he had died before the EMTs got there, or what it was, because ultimately at that point the scene had become a hostage situation. So they weren't approaching because they didn't know how many gunmen there were. They didn't know if there were gunmen with snipers. They didn't know anything. And at this point, getting a timeline for what was happening was incredibly difficult. The police didn't know if, people were still outside shooting while people were inside. They didn't realize at the time that they had walked into the school, and as they were walking in, they were shooting people. They didn't know. But again, it was still quite upsetting, and I totally empathize with the family who, more than likely had to find out their child was dead by watching the television and seeing him propped up against the school. I just can't even imagine that whole thing. Once they got inside the school, Dylan first went to check on, or presumably went to check on the bomb in the cafeteria because it hadn't gone off and they had hoped that it would go off. But he didn't shoot anyone while he was in there. Eric kind of remained outside. He was kind of on guard. He shot Anne-Marie Hochhalter, who became partially paralyzed. He also threw some pipe bombs, but they didn't result in any casualties. The first officer arrived on the scene at 11:22. He was responding to a female down call, but quickly upon arriving, he realized it was an active shooter situation, which completely changes the way in which police respond to calls. Officer Gardner and Eric did exchange gunfire, but no one ended up being hurt. And then at that point, he called for backup. I did want to mention someone else important in this story is William Sanders. He was a teacher that was in the cafeteria at the time, and he heard the gunfire, and he began to warn the students to get out. And he ended up saving so many lives that day. We are going to talk about him more, but they also hit Michael Johnson, who survived, and Mark Taylor, who played dead in order to survive. A lot of the students ended up playing dead in order to survive. I don't want to overwhelm this video with details of every single thing that is happening, so I am going to skip some parts, but I wanted to kind of set the scene of what it was probably like that day as they walked into the school and how fast things happened, because within 22 minutes, they had already shot several people. And then I also wanted you to get an idea of how quickly it started and how quickly it ended. But let's talk about Dave Sanders for a minute, because he was seriously the hero of the day. He led students from the cafeteria upstairs to some classrooms, and along the way he tried to get students to safety. As many students as he could round up, he tried to get them to safety. He got students into the library, he got students into different classrooms, and upon trying to get students into classrooms, he ended up being shot by both Eric and Dylan. And he made his way into the science classroom, which has become notorious for many reasons. And there was a student by the name of Aaron Hansey, who was a Eagle Scout, who began administering first aid. And he administered first aid to Dave Sanders for over 3 hours. The students came together and put a sign at the window, and the sign said, "1 bleeding to death," because they wanted to save him. They desperately wanted to save him. He saved so many lives, and he was such a well-respected teacher at the school. And without him, I can't imagine how many of the students wouldn't have survived, because he had the bravery to go through and round students up and get them to a safe place. But nonetheless, he did end up passing away. Unfortunately, he was alive when the SWAT team arrived, but they were clearing the scene for paramedics, and the students were really upset about this, and Aaron Hansey was actually very hesitant to leave him. He'd been administering first aid and had been keeping him alive for 3 hours. So he very reluctantly went with the SWAT team on the promise that paramedics would be in soon, and by the time paramedics got there, he was gone. So that also resulted in some lawsuits, but ultimately, I do understand, like, SWAT teams are not trained in that capacity, and at this point, they had not found the shooters. They still didn't know how many shooters there were, but it was really sad to learn about that. And something to consider when we're talking about this is that this happened pre-9/11. This happened before Sandy Hook and Parkland, and, before this became an issue. I mean, it was always an issue. It was post Oklahoma City bombing, which actually inspired Eric Harris, but there was no handbook for how to deal with things like this for students, police, everything. And there's actually been policy rewritings because of what happened on this day. And another interesting part, and something that I think we should all consider, is that Columbine did have police at the school. It just so happened that policeman, he wasn't there. I think we'll talk about it, but he was on lunch or something like that. So that's something to consider, that even schools with police presence are not immune to these issues. But I do want to talk about everything that went wrong on this day, because there are so many things that went wrong, from the media, police, everything. So for months prior to Columbine, Eric and Dylan had been talking about killing people, especially Eric. And both had been in trouble with the law prior to the Columbine shooting. And they often were portrayed after the fact as outcasts, goths, and things like that. But the truth of the matter was that Eric was actually incredibly popular. And while Dylan was a little bit quieter, he kind of gained some popularity from hanging out with Eric, who was a more popular student. Now, Columbine was a really big school, so it wasn't, it wasn't like they were popular in the same way that maybe you would picture it if you came from a smaller town. But they had friends. They were not outcasts. They were not loners. They actually had, the police department themselves had been contacted several times by one particular family who had major issues with Eric. He was continually making threats to the family, harassing the family, stalking the family, and he had actually discussed with multiple people about his ability to make pipe bombs, his obsession with guns, things like that. There were a lot of things, a lot of red flags that had something happened of real consequence could have potentially saved lives that day. And Eric was also diagnosed with depression and intense anger issues, but that didn't come out until his diaries were public. Even with all this, I don't, they were not outcasts or loners. It seemed like they were two very troubled kids who just felt like doing something bad. That's ultimately what it came down to. So the way the police handled Columbine still comes into question today, and there have been multiple lawsuits that have popped up because of the way in which police handled Columbine. One of the mistakes that they made was taking eyewitness testimony from students as they were leaving the school. Now, eyewitness testimony is expected. They were trying to get a handle upon what was happening inside the school. But the problem with that was that many of the students inside the school were watching news coverage. And many of the students had not seen the shooters or had not seen what was going on, and instead were repeating their eyewitness testimony to police when in fact their eyewitness testimony was coming from things that were being said on the news. So it was hard for the police to get an idea of what was going on. And what started to happen is they heard that there were men in trench coats, there were men in baseball caps, there were men in t-shirts, and they thought that there were multiple shooters when what they were describing was Eric and Dylan taking off their trench coats and taking off their ball caps and then getting down to their t-shirts. And so it was all the same person. They just didn't realize it at the time. And this is something that we really don't know if it was intentional, if the boys even thought about that, but it is something that happened, and it convoluted the stories. And it also delayed the police getting inside because they didn't know where the boys were. And the other thing that was going on was many of the students were calling 911 for updates, and they were also, again, watching the news. So something else that was happening was many of the students were calling news stations from inside the school, telling them what they were seeing, but they were actually repeating things that they were hearing on the news. So misinformation began spreading quite literally like wildfire. The misinformation began spreading for days and days after the shootings, for years after, in fact, because the way that we talk about Columbine and the way that the news talks about Columbine even now has been highly affected by the media coverage from that day. And an interesting fact about this is many of the things a lot of the information that I got for this video came from a book written by one of the news anchors from that day, who realized in hindsight that he had made a lot of mistakes and was kind of going back and setting the record straight, if you will. an important piece of context that's often overlooked, and I've said it before, but I'm going to say it again, is that Columbine was a huge school, and many people did not even know who Dylan and Eric were. So a lot of the people that wanted to talk about, they killed there was a story about them killing jocks in white hats. That wasn't true. They weren't systematically killing the popular kids, which was another myth that went on. It truly was a random act of killing. The only non-random act it seemed like they weren't committing was one of their friends was outside as they arrived in school, because something I forgot to mention is that day they were actually late for school, and people noticed that they were gone, but they really didn't give it much thought. They thought they were just skipping school, which they had done in the past, especially together, because they got closer as it got closer to the day that they planned on shooting everyone. And one of their friends walked out like, hey, like, where have you guys been? And they told him to leave. They said, don't go in there. You're not going to want to be in there. And the boy thought that was strange, but he listened and he did leave. And thankfully he did, because he survived that day. I do want to go back to the library, because the library is ultimately where Eric and Dylan ended up dying. And they died about 45 minutes after they started shooting. And part of this it was interesting to see the way that they acted after the shooting. I do want to talk about the FBI agent that was there, and for some reason I don't have his name written down, so I will put something on the screen with his name. But an FBI agent responded to the scene kind of by accident. He heard what was going on, and his son was a student at the school. And so he arrived on the scene and had trouble getting information about what was going on for many of the reasons that I talked about. So he was a former psychologist turned FBI agent, and he decided to use his skills as a psychologist and as a hostage negotiator to help the police try to make a game plan. Because, as I said, there was no handbook for these types of things. The problem was, a few years before this, his son had actually made a joke video about a Columbine shooting. And it was just one of those things that was coincidence, but it became quite the scandal, especially with how much he inserted himself into the case, because he was, like I said, he was the first FBI agent on the scene, and he kind of became the point man for this case. But unfortunately, once it came out that his son had this scandal and things have been talked about before, his credibility kind of came into question. Whether I agree with that or not, I don't know, but it did put a really negative light on a situation that was already questionable when you consider the fact that he was investigating this as a parent of a victim of the shooting, which, to be fair, the same could be said about a lot of the policemen on the scene as well. But when you consider that he really stepped in and how much he stepped in to help, it just became a little bit questionable. But he reviewed the footage of the way they were acting after they shot the last person, or right before going into the library where they ended up committing suicide. And he explained that many psychopaths or sociopaths that want to kill, especially in terms of like murder, suicide, is like they have this big high when they're first going in. And what people don't realize is how quickly that high goes away. And it was very apparent when you watched the videos of Eric and Dylan. They were kind of pacing around the school, and they had just this like somber look. They were not really talking, and they didn't even seem angry. It was just very obvious that like what they were doing was not making them happy. Whereas when you first see them go around, there was this like adrenaline and this thrill that they were feeling that was very apparent. And it was almost like they were disappointed that this high wasn't lasting longer. And so it was that point that they went to the library. But I want to talk about the library because one of the most prominent stories is a story of Cassie Bernal. She was the one that was posthumously called a martyr. It was alleged that Dylan asked her if she believed, or Eric asked her if she believed in God. And when she said yes, she was shot and killed. Cassie's family, they took this and they ran with it. Her mom wrote a book. They did many talks in different churches about Cassie the saint. I mean, they literally were like thought about making her into a saint. There was a lot of skepticism around this story, rightfully so. And especially when it began to lead to financial gain for the Bernal family. Because at first it just seemed like one of those things. It's like, why wouldn't you want to remember your child this way? But then they started to make money off of it. And so people were like, let's dig a little bit more. So that was when another student named Valine Schnur, she came forward saying that she was the one who actually was asked if she believed in God. And she said yes. And so Emily Wyant, who was the one that actually witnessed Cassie's death, it was so traumatic for her. I can't imagine. They were both under the table when Eric came upon them and slammed his fist on the table and said peekaboo before shooting and killing Cassie. And she said that that was never a question that was asked to Cassie. Cassie never said yes. So this further corroborated Valine's story. But unfortunately for Valine, who was a survivor of this tragedy, not only did she survive this horrible thing, but then she was constantly accused of trying to steal Cassie's thunder. And she was basically ostracized from the Christian community. There was actually this report of her doing this talk at like a Christian festival, and she was literally booed off the stage. Because I guess it doesn't make as good of a story if you don't die. I don't know. Like, not only did all that happen, she had to live through like all of these lies about Cassie when she was the one. And while I have a lot of sympathy for the Bernal family, like of course I do, they lost a child. I don't love that it came at the cost of someone else's reputation. It all seemed like it was just like the hill that they were going to die on, you know, like they were not going to back down and admit that this didn't actually happen. Oh, I want to say, like I said, they did end up committing suicide in the library, and that's where they were found. When the SWAT team came up the stairs and found them, it was then that they realized that the shooting was over, because they had been all throughout the school, and the library was one of the last places that they had checked. And they found Eric and Dylan, and initially they didn't know if they were just victims or whatever when they first walked in, but then upon seeing them with the guns laying next to them, they quickly realized that they were the shooters. There were other stories that happened in the library, one of Patrick, and if you want to learn more about that, you should definitely look it up, because it's a very harrowing story. He ended up like defying all the odds, and he survived despite being shot in the head, and he climbed out of the library window and truly it was an act of I'm not like a Christian or anything, but like an act of God. Like he really, like, I don't know how he survived, but I would definitely look him up. He has done a lot of great things, and it's a very inspiring story. So I wanted to keep this as depressing as possible, so I didn't really include much of his story because I could have done a whole video on him, but definitely look it up because it's very interesting. But from this, there were so many policies that came after this, because I said that there were so many screw ups. It was like the police were screwing up, the media was screwing up, and this was one of the first instances where in real time, people could turn on the TV and watch as this was happening. And what's funny is like, so I mentioned that Columbine High School was a giant high school. So many of the students, they wanted to clear the scene as much as they could because they weren't sure if there were bombs, they didn't know what was going on. So many of them, like, there was a field, and right across the field was a suburb or a subdivision. And many of these people were just piling into other people's homes. And which is so funny to think about now because that would not happen. But there's kind of this like thought process that they were missing, which is like, what would have happened if the gunman had walked out and went to one of these homes? And that was actually something that one of the moms later, she talked about. She had like something like 150 students inside of her home, and they still hadn't found the shooters. They didn't know if there was still shooting happening. Like, they didn't really know what was going on. And she started thinking, what if the shooter had gotten out and they're in my house right now? What would happen? So that was definitely something that would not happen now. And I think the intention was to get the students off the scene as quickly as possible, which was a good intention, but ultimately it could have really put a lot of people at risk. And they actually sent them to elementary schools to hold out because that ended up being the meeting place. Like, if parents were looking for their children to go to this school because they didn't know how many people had died and they couldn't identify all the people that had died just yet. This was the first time that you could watch something like this happening live on TV. And because of that, it became just a shit show because things weren't getting vetted, claims weren't getting vetted, people were just saying things and not knowing what was really happening. The only myth that ended up being true, I feel like, was the fact that like Eric had this white supremacy complex. He was obsessed with Germany, he was obsessed with Hitler, and he really did feel like he was a superior human. And while his journals didn't show hatred towards specific races, if nothing else, he was a huge Nazi sympathizer. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that all this was happening during the height of the Satanic Panic, which also skewed the headlines immensely and also could have directly contributed to the martyrdom of Cassie Bernal. With these change in policies like the zero tolerance policy, the metal detectors and all of and putting more police in schools, putting armed police in schools, things like that, there were some pretty massive consequences. Also lawsuits. There were so many lawsuits regarding this. Having police in school meant that Black kids were disproportionately targeted for petty crimes. They ended up getting suspended more often for breaking small rules. It led to more in-school suspensions, more expulsions for minor infractions. And there's actually a book about the school-to-prison pipeline, which they have kind of directly contributed to some of the policies that were put into place post-Columbine and post-9/11, which is ironic since Columbine was committed by two white guys, one in which was a white supremacist, and also most mass shootings are committed by white men and not Black men. Metal detectors were controversial because many schools didn't want to implement them because it broke the facade that school was a safer place. And the zero tolerance policy had the most impact because it wasn't really clear what constituted as a threat. There were students that were getting expelled for simply expressing a disdain for their school or their principal or a specific person. And what the zero tolerance policy meant was that literally they had a zero tolerance policy for anything. And again, this led to Black kids getting disproportionately targeted for minor infractions like just saying that they don't like school. It really did lead to full-blown investigations over minor jokes, and it did nothing to stop school shootings. So there also was a very large conversation around guns because ultimately these guns were sort of kind of purchased legally, but not really. They were not purchased by Dylan or Eric, despite the fact that Eric could have legally purchased guns before Columbine, but they were stockpiling weapons. And one of the guns, or a few of the guns, were bought by one of their friends who was of legal age, and then also by the families. The families had guns in their home. While I understand that there is a Second Amendment law that, in terms of gun control, not to put myself into this, I'm a fan of common sense gun laws, but I'm not a fan of completely banning weapons. But many of the guns that were purchased for this were purchased through gun shows and through loophole laws or just lenient gun laws in general. I don't want to harp on this too much, but I feel like at some point we do need to have this conversation because children are dying. Just to throw that out there. And mass shooting aside, suicide is the second most leading cause of death in young adults, especially men. And suicide by firearm is consistently the top of the list, especially for young adult men. And for some reason, that's not important enough for legislative overhaul. So I don't know. And it's interesting because a country like Australia, after their first mass shooting, they banned guns and had gun buybacks, and they have not had a mass shooting since, which is incredibly interesting. Especially since in 2020, we saw the lowest number of mass shootings because everything was shut down and there was no school. So, very interesting. The NRA actually did talk about this a lot because there was a gun convention that was supposed to happen pretty recently after the Columbine shooting, and they were like, what do we do? This seems kind of gauche to have this thing happen. And the problem is these conventions make a lot of money for the towns and or for the state, and so obviously Colorado wanted that because it would lead to a lot of revenue, but then there's a lot of discussion about it. Ultimately, I'm not going to harp on the NRA. I feel like they did the best they could given the situation. You can look up what their response to Columbine was and what their response to mass shootings always are. A lot of I feel like a lot of right wingers aren't into the NRA because I feel like they've gotten a little bit more. They've had some concessions, but that's it. That is me debunking the myths of Columbine. It's a bummer, and it's a bummer because nothing really happened. They still have not had a good solution for how to prevent mass shootings in schools, how to protect kids, because, look at what happened at Sandy Hook. Look at what happened at Parkland. It's just crazy. It's truly crazy. And not even that, gun violence itself, there's just so much. And it's such a bummer when it could have been prevented had they had some sort of consequence for their actions before they shot up their school. So that's it. That's all I have for today. If there are any other cases you want me to explore, I think I mentioned in my last video that the ones that are a little bit more serious, I like to sit down and talk about and not put on makeup or do anything distracting. But my Unsolved Mysteries and Underwhelming Makeup series, my preference is to do my makeup while we talk, kind of less scripted, more on the fly. And I think the next video I'm going to film for that is the pandemic that never happened. So stay tuned for that. But I think I might film today a video about reacting to anti-vax content on my timeline. So if that sounds like something you're into, please make sure you subscribe. And that's it. Thank you guys for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.